So hi everyone, welcome to the first online event of the Babel project. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this event. Babel stands for Basic Income in Belgium, and it's a large-scale research project funded by the Belgian Science Office Belspol. We have a fantastic program ahead of us with presentations on basic income experiments and pilots outside and within Europe, and with reflections on what can be learned from this for the functioning of European welfare states. What are the limits of basic income experiments, and learning more about basic income as a potential pathway to a better welfare state? What role can basic income play in improving minimum income protection for all? And of course, we also want to hear from you. So at the end of each session, we'll have room for Q&A. And if you want to ask questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A function in Zoom. So we will have an eye on this chat box, and we will discuss the questions you might have at the end of each session. Before I give the floor to the presenters, I'd like to give a brief introduction of the Babel project, of what the Babel project actually is about. The Babel project was developed in the context of basic income becoming center stage in debates on the future of welfare states all over the world. And of course, there have been earlier waves of interest in basic income, but now it seems to be different in a way, because a variety of experiments and pilot projects have been set up, many of them being widely mediatized. And the idea is discussed very concretely in light of waning standard employment arrangements, related social rights, due to automation and robotization. Many observers, for instance, expect a surge in platform work, but also in unemployment. And traditional welfare states, certainly the ones of the European kind, are not ready to deal with people working in non-standard employment relationships or with a massive increase in unemployment. However, although basic income is usually presented as a disarmingly simple idea, when push comes to shove, discussing concrete proposals quickly descends into a dispute of Tower of Babel-alike allure. Hence, of course, the reference to Babel in the project title. A lot of different basic income schemes can be imagined. A lot of different varieties have been proposed, but whether a basic income is actually a proposal that might make welfare states better very much depends on the nitty-gritty details. For instance, with respect to entitlement, with respect to the design, the specifics of the design of a basic income scheme, with respect to generosity of the basic income, with respect to financing issues, and with respect to the actual implementation. And all of these choices will impact the outcomes of a basic income in terms of its budget, in terms of poverty, in terms of inequality, and in terms of labor market effects. And that is where the Babel project comes in, basically. We want to take the idea of a basic income seriously, and we want to empirically examine whether, and if so, what specific design of basic income would be helpful to improve the functioning and to improve the outcomes of the Belgian welfare state. The Babel project, that is a team from 3 universities, from the KU Leuven, from the University of Saint-Louis, UC Leuven in Brussels, and University of Antwerp. And I would like to spotlight 2 persons in particular, the PhD students, Marie-Laure Moulay and Cyril Francisco, who did a fantastic job in organizing this event. So a big thank you to the both of you for that. So very concretely, by way of introducing this event, what do we do, or what do we want to do in the Babel project? First of all, what we want to do is to conduct comprehensive microsimulation analysis. Microsimulation basically allows us to estimate what the effect is of policy reforms in the tax benefit system on poverty, on inequality, on work incentives, and on total cost. And what we will do is to test a variety of basic income schemes, including negative income taxes, and we will take due account of labor market changes and developments. For instance, we can see whether some varieties of basic income would lead to reduced poverty while improving work incentives. And then we would test whether the outcomes would still be good if we assume massive changes in the labor market. And of course, very importantly, which is usually neglected, we also examine so-called interaction effects. If a basic income scheme would replace certain existing benefits, for instance, this will have knock-on effects in other parts of the welfare state as well. And we need to take account of that. We need to take that into account in our empirical analysis, in our way of thinking about basic income. Of course, one of the issues is that we cannot estimate by these methods how people's behavior will change under a basic income scheme. For that, we need experiments or actual pilot projects, of which we will have some very interesting presentations later on today. But in the Babel project, we also try to use an experimental approach to examine this. We will exploit the existence of a specific form of a lottery in Belgium called Win for Life. And this is basically, in our view, the closest we can get to a real life world basic income situation. Because the prize of the lottery is a monthly payment of €1,000, no questions asked, right? This is basically a basic income, of course, only for specific people who have won this lottery, but it's a basic income in the context of the developed European welfare state. And the question, of course, is how did this change people's behavior? What were the behavioral reactions in terms of labor supply? Did people start reducing their working hours, for instance? In terms of the entrepreneurship, did they take more risk, which is often assumed when a basic income would be implemented, that it would enhance risk taking, that people would be more incentivized, more motivated, to start their own business, for instance, or also in terms of retraining. Do people go to school again? Do they want to do they want to re-educate themselves? These are all things that we will try to find out using this experimental setup of the lottery. Of course, comparing the winners to a control group before and after winning the lottery, before and after getting this basic income, right? But that's still not enough, because we also want to know how the general public is feeling about this. To make a substantial reform of the welfare state a success, and implementing a basic income would be a substantial overhaul of European welfare state, of the Belgian welfare state. Such a reform needs to garner sufficient public support. And this is what we test with survey experiments, with so-called vignette experiments. We designed a specific survey that allowed us to find out which factors of basic income are important in people's attitudes towards basic income, and how changes in these details, how changes in these factors would lead to an increase or a decrease in popular support. For instance, it is usually found that if you ask people in general terms whether they would support the basic income, that the majority of people say, yes, we would like to support it. This is a great idea. But once you start adding details to this, this would be the consequence. This would be the consequence in terms of financing, in terms of taxes. This would be the consequence in terms of poverty. This would be the consequence in terms of existing benefits that you might be entitled to. Then, of course, public support really changes. And our goal is to know what kind of particular basic income variety, taking into account all of these details, would garner the most public support. And this is the kind of support that we would need if we think seriously about basic income as an alternative or as a complement for the existing welfare state system in Belgium. And of course, then combining the 1 and 3, we would end up with a basic income proposal that would be popular, that would garner sufficient support, and yield also good outcomes, or the sort of outcomes that we want to see in terms of poverty, for instance, in terms of inequality reduction, in terms of social protection. And then in the next phase, if we have all this information, if we gathered all this information, then we start thinking really, what does this mean in practice? What does this mean if we really want to implement this in Belgium? So we pay due attention to the on-the-ground implementation and the technical and administrative feasibility of a selection of popular and effective basic income proposals. So we really want to dive into the nuts and bolts of the on-the-ground implementation. We really want to examine in detail what needs to be done to put a theoretical basic income proposal, and they usually are theoretical, into actual practice of the Belgian welfare state. And in doing so, we also involve the social partners, which in the Belgian context are important gatekeepers of the welfare state system. So we really want to involve them and also try to tease out, also want to know what they really feel about this, how they feel about this. Would they be in favor of a basic income or not? So we want to extend the social partners as gatekeepers in the Belgian welfare state and whether they are willing to support the implementation of these schemes. And then finally, at the end of the project, within 3 years, hopefully we'll end up with a sort of a blueprint, right? So we started from a basic income as an abstract theoretical idea with a lot of varieties, with a lot of potential differences. We tried to tease out what would work best. We want to know more about behavioral reaction. We want to know more about popular support. What kind of basic income proposal would garner this support? What would be feasible in terms of practical implementation? And then we want to end up with a sort of a blueprint, right? A blueprint towards a basic income proposal in Belgium, in the Belgian welfare state. A basic income proposal that is likely to garner sufficient support by the general public and by the social partners. A basic income proposal that will lead to better outcomes in terms of social protection, work incentives. And so a basic income proposal that would actually be able to inspire feasible welfare state reforms in Belgium. And I also wanted to show you some very first results of the experimental survey, right? That's one of the research activities that we already conducted. We are in the midst of analyzing this, but I wanted to give you a sort of a first taste of what comes out of this, right? So we asked people what kind of basic income proposal that they would be supportive of. And we tried to tease out in experimental ways what the factors are that would determine people's support for a basic income proposal, right? And if you, for instance, propose to people that a basic income would be available for everyone, including newcomers in Belgium, including migrants, then support for a basic income proposal drops. This is important to take into account. If really everybody would be entitled to a basic income, then popular support drops substantially. If a basic income, for instance, is presented as having no work requirements at all, which is of course at the core, right, of this disarmingly simple idea, then support drops. But if you present it in a way that it would require, for instance, care support work, or that some sort of participation would be required, not necessarily in the labor market, but some sort of participation, then support increases again for that proposal. Support increases if the monthly amount of basic income is higher, which is of course not really a surprise. But the support drops if this higher amount needs to be taxed, it needs to be financed by an increase in taxes, right? So again, what you propose in terms of the actual proposal will have consequences for how you pay for this. And how you pay for this will also determine what people want to support or what kind of proposal that people want to support. For instance, if you present to people a basic income proposal that would be financed through a tax on capital, then support increases again, right? But then again, the question is, how would you do this in practice, right? How could you use a capital income tax to finance a basic income scheme? So this is only a very first set of results, very first set of insights, but these are the kinds of things that we are really interested in. We want to go beyond what we already know. We want to go beyond the abstract and really think about this in a very, very practical way. So if you want to know more about the Babel project, it's ongoing. It started last year in October. So we are really in the midst of gathering all the data of doing these analyses. If you want to know more, you can go to our website, babelproject.be. And so let's move over, of course, to what you all came for to see and to hear and to listen to the actual sessions on the basic income proposals, experiments, and pilots all across the world. Maybe some practical guidelines first. So everyone is muted during the presentations. If you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A or the chat function for that, right? We will keep an eye on this, and we will read these questions out aloud at the end of each session so that the presenters have the opportunity to reply or to respond to these questions, right? We will have 2 presentations in the first session of each of a half an hour, which will be followed by a reflection on these 2 presentations of 15 minutes. And then there's still time for the Q&A. Right? I also want to mention that this event will be recorded and will be made available free of charge, of course, open access on our website afterwards. And so I'm very happy to introduce you to the first plenary speaker of the day, Dr. Young-Sung Yu from the Gyeonggi Research Institute in Korea. Dr. Yu is a senior research fellow at the Gyeonggi Research Institute. He's the head of Basic Income Research Group, and he's an adjunct research fellow at the Center for Polar and Watershed Research. Since 2007, he is also an adjunct lecturer at South Seoul University. He has been a policy advisor to the Gyeonggi province governor and other advisory positions for 11 forums, Korea, America, Committee of Gyeonggi, EU City, and others. His research interests cover general economic issues, environmental economics and valuation, information and technology economics, public investment assessment, long-term development planning, and future studies. In his presentation, he will be assisted by Ichin Yu, who is a researcher at the Gyeonggi Research Institute since 2021. The talk will be, of course, about the empirical results of the Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income project and the implications of this. Dr. Yu, you have the floor for half an hour. I will be keeping track of time, and I will give you a signal when we approach the end of the half hour. Thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Let me just share my screen first. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see this perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Young-Sung Yu. Me and my colleague, Mr. Ik-Jin Yu, will do the presentation together. As you see, the topic is empirical results of Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income and their implication. Ik-Jin Yu will speak first, and I will do later in turn. Now I hand over the mic to Ik-Jin Yu.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Firstly, it's a great honor to give a presentation at this conference. As introduced, my name is Ik-Jin Yu. I'm a researcher of Basic Income Research Group at Gyeonggi Research Institute. So today, I'm going to start with an overview of Gyeonggi Basic Income programs, and then move on to the implementation of Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income. And lastly, Dr. Yu is going to delve into the policy effects of Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income. As you can see in the table, there are 4 main basic income programs in Gyeonggi province. They are Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income, Gyeonggi Disaster Basic Income, Gyeonggi Farmers Basic Income, and lastly, Gyeonggi Rural Basic Income. Out of these 4 programs, we're going to deeply deal with Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income today in this presentation. Let's delve into Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income. Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income did not happen out of the blue. It is the expanded version of youth dividend in Seongnam, which is the city in Gyeonggi province. Young people aged 24 who lived in Seongnam city for at least 3 consecutive years got 125,000 Korean won in 2016 and 250,000 Korean won in 2017 and 18 on a quarterly basis. It was paid in the form of local currency of Seongnam city. Youth basic income is very similar to youth dividend. It can be said that youth dividend has been newly branded into youth basic income. After Jae Myung-lee, then the mayor of Seongnam city, was elected as a governor of Gyeonggi province, he expanded his basic income policy on a provincial level. Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income is a 4-year program starting from 2019 and ending in 2022. Just like youth dividend, young people aged 24 who have lived in Gyeonggi province for at least 3 consecutive years can get 250,000 Korean won on a quarterly basis. This means they can receive 1 million Korean won in total, which is over 800 US dollars. And this is also given in the form of local currency. Before moving on to the policy effects of Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income, it is very necessary to deal with this question: is Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income a basic income? In order to answer this question, we can refer to the definition of basic income provided by BN, Basic Income Earth Network. As you can see in the table, the features of Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income are quite consistent with 5 essential features of basic income, except the fact that the recipients are limited to 24-year-olds and they receive basic income just for a year. Since Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income only targets on 24-year-olds, it meets categorical universality. In addition, because of this fact, 1-year payment is unavoidable. But since it is paid on a quarterly basis, we can say that it is semi-periodic. In addition to this, it is also very important to mention the role of local currency. Local currency is not a legal tender, but it is neither voucher nor in kind. The local currency policy has been designed to boost the local economy, and this policy is one of the most representative policies that the governor strongly supports. Every basic income policy in Gyeonggi province is paid in the form of local currency. Let's move on to the next chapter, policy effects of Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income. From here, Dr. Yu is going to take over the rest of the presentation.
Okay, as you might know, a mixed method of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis is widely preferred in examining the policy effect. Regarding the quantitative analysis, difference in differences method is used. This is known as double differencing. The purpose of double differencing is to correct bias from the ex ante and ex post comparison of the experimental group or between group comparison in the ex post survey under the parallel trend assumption. It is widely used for the analysis of policy effects because it is not only easy to implement and interpret, but also simple to expand. This is more robust than t-test, which simply compares the mean of values between different groups. DID analysis out of things being equal, if the parallel assumption holds between the treated group and the comparison group, which assumes there is no intervention on one particular group. But the actual policy effect can be estimated as illustrated in the graph. And the outline of the quantitative analysis is as follows. The first survey was conducted at the beginning of the program in April 2019, and the final survey was conducted at the end of the program in April 2020. Recipients who participated in both surveys are roughly 11,335, which were taken as an experimental group. And a comparison group consists of 800 participants in both surveys, and they live outside the Gyeonggi province. In the DID analysis, however, we had only 2,961 and 626 participants for the experimental group and the comparison group, respectively. It was because we went through data cleaning process for the purpose of minimizing errors in response, leading to more accurate analysis. There are 40 dependent variables that have been classified into 5 categorical categories, such as happiness, health and diet, perceptions and attitudes, economic activities, and lastly, dream capital. One thing to notice is that we use the dream capital variables, which may be not familiar with you because these are rarely used in other basic income surveys. Dream capital includes imagination, hope, optimism, and resilience. This came from the understanding that the dream capture is very important, especially for young generation, just like any other forms of social capital. At the bottom, the regression equation, the coefficient beta 3 represents the actual effect as depicted in the previous graph. And this table summarizes the result of regression analysis of DID. It is not surprising that the use-based income has significant effects on many variables such as life satisfaction, work value, happiness, health status, workout frequency, diet, and so forth. But the use-based income did not affect some variables contrary to the expectations. A new finding can also be observed in this analysis, which is dream capture. Since dream capture is meaningful, especially for young generation, as mentioned before, the fact that use-based income had a positive influence on 24-year-olds shows us a great sign. For the analysis in the previous slide, we did not deal with control variables, but this table shows the result after including control variables, which education, marital status, household type, housing type, and type of economic activity. After controlling such variables as above, we could still see the positive effects of Gyeonggi use-based income on recipients' happiness, and this is statistically significant. This table is just an example for 5 happiness items, but we did the same analysis on other items as well. And moving on to the next, the qualitative analysis did not simply aim to present to what degree the recipients are satisfied with the program. Instead, this analysis focused more on the narratives of the youth, which may influence the attitude toward basic income. The findings of this analysis have important implications for implementing a basic income. We did the semi-structured interviews with 25 participants and focus group interview, so-called FGI, with 17 participants divided into 3 groups, which are job seekers, startup workers, and pharmacy students. Topics that we dealt with are the process of applying and receiving of use-based income, how to perceive use-based income, life of use, how to understand the basic income, and conceiving life changes with the basic income in the future. In order to hear various voices from the youth, we designed to choose the participant carefully. As we can see in the table, we consider the situation features of the youth rather than personal features. After that, we classified them into 14 and 5 categories for individual interview and FGI, respectively. The number of the people we plan to interview is 28 from number. You can see the table on the slide, number 1 to number 14. And that for FGI is 13 from number 16 to number 19. Okay. This table shows how we classified carefully the chosen participants in detail. We are not able to interview all the participants as we planned because of COVID-19 pandemic. After all, it was possible for us to classify them into 13 and 3 categories for individual interview and FGI respectively. And for the purpose of collecting various voices of the youth, we considered the personal characteristics, household characteristics, policy experience, youth labor and life. Meanwhile, for FGI, we included the persons preparing for civil service or a public corporation examination, the persons preparing or working for a startup and former student for the purpose of examining various types of life of the youth. And now I will talk about the findings of this qualitative analysis. Firstly, the results show that the youth basic income gave a great opportunity for them to realize the importance of basic income features, which are universality and conditionality and individuality that they never experienced before. Secondly, there was a huge gap between the ideal purpose of a basic income and the perceptions of young people towards basic income. For example, some basic income advocates emphasize the freedom of labor, at least to some extent. But many interviewees in this survey expressed a strong desire for labor because they think it is the main source of income and a means for gaining social recognition, self-esteem, or self-respect, and a sense of belonging to a society. This finding leads us to think about how we can reduce the pressure having a decent job without losing social recognition. Otherwise, how can we change their established attitude towards labor? Yeah. Moreover, it was not easy for the research participants to interpret youth basic income as a social right given to all without any strings attached. So they consider the youth basic income a sort of assistance for the vulnerable or an investment that has to be paid back in any ways. Young people who receive the youth basic income experienced something new. They found the they found the grant interesting, but also found that it goes against their social norms. It was quite a challenge for them to imagine a society with a basic income. Therefore, it is crucial to bridge the gap between the ideal and the reality to remake the world with a basic income. In conclusion, it can be said that the youth basic income had positive influences on the recipients based on our research using the both of quantitative and qualitative analysis. This is the report which contains details of the topic presented so far. Please refer to it. The files are noted on the GRA website. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, thank you so much for a really interesting talk, and also perfectly on time. Even we even have some spare time left, which is good, of course, for the Q&A. But I wanted to ask you one question before we move on to the next presenter. Can you give a bit more context or a bit more information on the youth basic income? So it was implemented in 2019, if I'm correct. What was the reason for actually implementing this? And is it the objective, the goal, to keep on giving this to all 24-year-olds in the next years to come?
Okay, so basically, Lee Jae-myung, the governor of Gyeonggi province, he wanted to support the young generation because they don't have any welfare policies or something like that. And the reason why he chose to give youth basic income to 24-year-olds was because if you are 24-year-old in Korea, you are middle of nowhere, meaning that you're not a student or you're not a worker. So that means you don't have any income. So that's why Jae-myung Lee wanted to start this project, Youth Basic Income.
Okay, thank you. So for me, at least, it's very interesting to see that, or to hear at least, that the youth basic income was basically an answer to a gap in the welfare state system, right? So there was a problem, or there was a group, an age group, that really did not benefit from decent income protection at that particular time in their lives, and the youth basic income was a sort of an answer to that problem.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, Thank you so much. I see that Adeline wants to ask something. Yes.
Very short question of clarification out of pure interest. What is low energy youth? I saw that this was one of the categories you interviewed.
Can you say that again, please?
Sorry, I saw that you interviewed in your categorization of people you interviewed, you indicated low energy youth. What does this mean?
So low energy means that you don't see the future very bright. So you get depressed, and that means low energy. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Okay, so
Yeah, there is a kind of a lack of vitality in during his life. Okay, do you understand it?
yes, thank you so much. And so it was for me also interesting to hear that the recipients of the youth basic income actually thought this was going against the social norm, right? And that they try to adapt in a way to receiving that basic income. This is really, really interesting to hear. So I'd be happy to hear what the audience thinks about this. So please use the Q&A and the chat box if you have any questions on this. So in the meantime, I would like to move over to the next presentation of this session. And of course, so as explained before, at the end of the session, we'll have plenty of time to further dig into these issues and to answer all of your questions about this. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the second presenter of this session, Dr. Jurgen Schub. He's a senior research fellow at the longitudinal Socio-Economic panel study, the Schupp, and at the DIW in Berlin, which is the Deutsches Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Since 2013, he's also a professor of sociology at the Free University in Berlin, and he's currently monitoring and implementing the survey research related to the basic income pilot project in Germany. In the past, he was a vice dean of graduate studies at the DIW Graduate Center of Economic and Social Research. He worked as a survey manager, as a deputy director, and as director of the research unit of the Schupp. So Jürgen, you have the floor for half an hour. Thank you.
You still have to unmute yourself,
Yes,
I'm afraid.
okay. So,
and I think you have to start the PowerPoint presentation because now we see your entire PowerPoint slides and not just one slide.
Yeah. So now, okay, now it looks quite better. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and giving me the opportunity to talk on an RCT on basic income. I'm not ready to present results as in the last presentation. We are just in the middle, more or less, or at the starting point of the empirical analysis. This is joint work with colleagues from Max Planck Institute, Susanne Fiedler, Frederick Schwerter from University of Cologne, and Max Kasi at University in Oxford, who is, that is a joint team of the research team of an quite unusual experimental design and governance of an RCT on basic income I will present. Our starting point was the current debate on basic income, and So we looked on what is the preference of the German population for being ready for a UBI. And here you see a report published on data of the ESS, European Social Survey, and the module on Germany, and we added additional pilots also in SERP on that issue. And you can see that we have a divide of the population. About half of the population is supporting the idea of a UBI, and the other half is against it. And there is also some socio-demographic structure in that data of support or rejection. The younger and the better educated, but the low income group, and in the policy preference, more the left wing preferred population part is more or less stronger supporting a UBI than the other half of the population. So this is the general question on introducing a UBI, and we learned already that with vignette techniques you can find much more shades of preferences. But as a second indicator, I want to present a survey conducted by Lüders and Schröder in Germany last year, where they asked on the attitudes towards UBI against the existing system of social security in Germany. And here you can see that in that pie, the left side, or the green shaded supporters of UBI, is stronger than the supporters of our existing system. And I think that is also part of the German story of the support, or the public support also of UBI, that our existing system of social security, and especially the means-tested system of social security for those who are long-term unemployed, that had been reformed in the mid of or 15 years ago, does not have a strong preference of agreeableness of within the population, and that I think is part of the debate of UBI, that there is not a strong support in the existing system. And what is the why would a UBI be a really system change to our well-developed system of welfare state and social security in Germany? Well, I think the strongest point is that there is no longer an obligation to help yourself. That is the principle. That is also the DNA of our existing social security system. Without that obligation kind of subsidiarity, a UBI would be a completely new world. And therefore, I think there is also a lack of the classical micro-simulation studies, because their simulations are always in that old system, because the new system does not exist. And what will happen in the new system without obligation, nobody really knows. Therefore, we are also going in that direction, that we want to implement with on a new system of UBI. Looking at the on the current debate, that is a German version, that our majority are German authors, but you can see beside the axis of a refusal or the consent to a UBI, there is also a divide of supporters of an expansion of the existing welfare state, or deconstruction of the welfare state. So the key question is to substitute with the UBI or complement or supplement the existing system divides also the group of academic or political supporters of the UBI. Yeah, there is a liberal wing of those supporters who want to substitute our existing system, and there are other supporters who would be in favor for expanding and supplement this system. That makes it complicated, I think, to bring also this issue in the political arena, because there is a divide also in the motives to support that UBI. Well, are now UBI experiments in an existing world useful at all? I think I joined the quote of Karl Wiederquist, who wrote, well, they are in the world, they have their restrictions, but we should look that we make the best of the experiments. That is not, of course, the truth we will find out, and I will talk on the limitations also on our study at the end of the presentation, but that was the starting point. Let's try it and do it at the best we can do it. So what is the context and how we did it? What is our governance? Well, there is a group in Germany based in Berlin. That's an association, Mein Grundeinkommen, and they have also a kind of lottery idea that they collect money by crowdfunding and then give the individuals by a lottery the opportunity to have a basic income of or unconditional cash transfer. It's the better word, I think, in an academic context, for 1 year without any restrictions and on top. And they did that. This project is quite successful. They started in 2014, and up to now they have nearly 900 people already got that UBI for 1 year, and they have supporters and funders of nearly 300,000 individuals, adults in Germany, who give small amounts of money each month or once per year to that association, to support that idea and to make UBI possible for people who got lottery ticket. And well, if you look and if we aggregate, they redistributed already 10 million euros from their beginning up to now within the civil society. That is the idea of that UBI. And that was the starting point. Also, I got in contact to the people who are running that that association, and Michael Bohmeyer, he's the founder of that initiative, and we were sitting together and were thinking of bringing that idea into in context of a decent research design. And that was the idea of our study, of our pilot project. That means we will try to have a RCT and then look on the effects and the causal link of that basic income streams, and we will compare a group of winners. So we grouped, we group now not randomly once each month that they start with a UBI. We grouped it at one point in time with 122 people who got the UBI, and we have a decent control group or comparison group, and then we will follow them over time. And that is the basic idea of our RCT. And well, the real start of the project was the launch of the idea, and that we invite the entire population, more or less, in Germany to participate if they are living in Germany, and adult population. That was the selection group. We made the call, the open call, with the press conference in Germany, and we were happy that and the design was communicated that we will give 122 individuals an amount of 1,200 euros for a period of 3 years. That was the call, and then the recruiting started of our design, and we expected that if we are successful with the call and the cooperation of an NGO and a scientific institute, that we will have about 1 million to grab then the participants of the study. But we were quite successful, I would say, and had more than 2 million volunteers, and within 3 months. So we ended the recruitment phase end of 2200, and communicated that there will be a final decision whether they will be invited into a baseline study, a survey that was made before the treatment, and the decision whether they were a winner or participant in the comparison group was done. So we made the final, or the research team then finalized or selected the 20,000 individuals for the invitation of the baseline study that took part in March, from March to end of March, and then we analyzed the baseline results and responses, and made the final selection of the participating group of the study of at the end 1,500 individuals, meaning divided in 122 for the winners and of the UBI, and 1,380 for the comparison group. So then for the selection of from our 2 million up to the final 1,500, what did we do? Well, we defined the final selection criteria, and we communicated also when we started then with the payment, also our decision, but we did not make that public at the very beginning, at the recruitment phase, to avoid that if we design what we really choose, that there will be fault or errors and in the answers of the recruitment phase. Therefore, here are the 3 criteria we selected. The individuals we took in the final consideration for the experiment had to be aged 21 to 40. They had to live in a 1-person household, and they had income threshold of 1,200 to 2,600 euros. That means that our existing welfare state, that state system with means tested income is out here. So we start not in the existing social security system. I think that is important to say, that of course, if they will lose their job and get unemployed during the 3 years, they will be observed and be part of the experiment, of course, but not at the starting point. So at the starting point, we have younger single person who have enough money so that the UBI comes really on top, and it will not be taxed or deducted within a system of social security benefits. So that was part of our selection, and then we for the final criteria we made, we considered characteristics of gender, level of education, and also the regional distribution, and also the question whether you support or you are against the UBI to have, and that we weighed about 50-50. That means our group of selected individuals also share the half are against and others are more or less supporters of the UBI before we started with a payout of the money. So what is the design of our, the methodological design of our 3 years? Well, we started with the payment in June of this year. That means in April we had the, or in March, end of March, we had the baseline study. Then the payment starts in June for the treated. And then the first focus, so-called focus wave, that will be always a web survey of about 15 to 20 minutes, will be in November, and we are just in the process of finalizing the survey for this first focus wave. Then there will be a baseline 2, exactly 1 year after the first of the payment, and then the next half year will be another focus wave, and then you see after the survey or the project will end in June 2024, and you can expect the final report also in August 2024. And we will make a preliminary first result report in early 2023. So that is a timetable of our empirical study. What content we are asking or researching? Well, the research topics of the questionnaire are more or less beside socio-demographic characteristics or over time, engagement in time and labor, and work, paid work, not non-paid work, different areas of consumption, and social preferences and also non-cognitive skills or personal traits are the content of our survey, and social and political engagement, and also indicators of well-being. That is more or less the groups of indicators we are asking, and also parts of it repeatedly each wave, but some indicators we replicate only in a 1 year or 2 year cycle in our design. So what can we expect to find out with that kind of study? Well, first of all, of course, we expect individual changes in behavior and also attitudes. So makes the unconditional money something, or if they save it, just save it, but it changes their attitudes, perhaps their fear and well-being to feel safe, but nothing in their behavior change. That's also an interesting issue we want to find out. The core interest of DIW, of course, will be on the individual effects on labor supply, wages, and job choices. That can be also bring new evidence on existing micro-simulation studies, because they always work with assumptions from another world, and therefore this is one of the key content interests. And of course, we will also have other issues we can find with our study on what can be derived from that study. It's important because there was a lot of public interest to make clear this is a kind of scientific enterprise, and therefore we have limited a part of truth we can tell on UBI. What this kind of study cannot contribute are questions on the effects of really long-term effects. That is a classical critique on RCTs, that they are just introduce it for a limited time, and real changes in behavior only will happen if this is lifelong UBI. And but that is, I think, a classical caveat we have. Also, we don't look on neighborhood effects that are individualized people living all over Germany, from Berlin to also the countryside, and therefore there will be no neighborhood effects of a UBI you can look for. Then you need a completely different design within one city or something like that. You can't talk on changes in production or consumption or on prices. All those macro effects, also the macro effect of a change in values or in culture, just by this tiny UBI experiment cannot be detected. If you want to find out, then you have to introduce UBI. What we also will not or cannot address with that study will be changes in migration flows. So on the one hand, outside, because people have to pay higher taxes in Germany to introduce a UBI, or an influx, potential influx, that people within European Union would go into a country where you can expect a UBI. That we cannot address. And also the big and final question on the effects of taxes, because you have to find a way for financing the UBI. This issue will also not be part of our study. So I will end with a summary of strengths and weaknesses of our design. I think the strength is that we will have useful and causal insights in the behavior and the attitudes of our design. Of course, there will be from an ethical point of view. Therefore, we also got permission by the ethical committee, because nobody will be worse off by just the status quo. Yeah, and that is of course also a restriction. This is a strength in this case, but of course in the real world, for an experiment to put into somebody in a position that he has to crap into his own pocket, not only in the endowment of the experiment, that is a major restriction of RCTs, I think. Of course, our design, we are not a state-funded enterprise. We have quite independence of our, if I say we, I mean, I'm talking on the group of researchers. We are independent in defining what we want to find out, and don't have to take into consideration what the funders, if it is the state and the policy, wants to find out. An experience that, especially for the Finnish experiment, was one of, I think, the weaknesses, that there was a lot of influence of the policy who were funding this experiment. On a weakness, I think I already mentioned that long-term effect and the macro effects, and of course with such a weakness also is to go in that direction and not to go the way and wait that, for example, the taxpayer represented by a government pays for the experiment in its large-scale numbers. Of course, we would be happy if we would not have only 122, but 1,000 or 1,200 treated individuals and participants. But with that design, it would be quite. That are the limitations of our governance, and a taxpayer experiment or a publicly funded experiment has a much bigger budget and more generous budget, and therefore you can make more detail on the statistical side. What are the opportunities of our design? Well, we will be able, hopefully, that we can falsificate some of the stereotypes and cliches that exist, how people will behave when a UBI on those who don't need it is implemented. Do they really get lazy? Is one of the questions we want to answer. I think that is one of the opportunities, and of course we will contribute to the existing and I think ongoing debate on a UBI with some statistical with some scientific knowledge then to the public debate. And of course, this is an opportunity. If it fails, there is a lower risk. What you in financial terms. The threats, I think, is the management of expectations. Usually there are too high expectations on such RCTs and of course one threat is also that we are in an open field of experiment, because the debate on that issue we are interested in is also changing. And yeah, we just had last week in Germany a report of a group of advisors of the Ministry for Finance who made a micro simulation study what would be needed in tax increases to introduce the crazy idea of a UBI. And those debates, of course, influence also perhaps those who are part of that ongoing field experiment. Potentially, it's hard to measure and to quantify. And of course, also one major restriction is we are talking on system change with at least in Germany, and all the institutional complex interdependencies is out of scope with such a experiment. Well, I don't have results, but from my expectation level, I would conclude with a conclusion Olli Kangas found out, and that is just this month published in a readable reader on the experiments in Finland. Well, he sums up that in Finland there is not UBI is not even after the experiment, and from a scientific point of view, also a successful experiment. There is no, in his view, no realistic policy option. But he ends, however, never say never. And yeah, therefore, thank you for your attention and your interest. And I'm happy also to answer your questions.
So yes, thank you so much, Jürgen. This is really exciting, and of course, we're very much looking forward to the results. And it's always good to know that even if the experiment fails, you know, that nobody won't get hurt, and that we still will learn a lot, right? So those are the best experiments, right? I see there are already some questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I will keep this for the end of this session. If you have any questions for our presenters, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, but I would like to give the floor first to our next speaker, Dr. Adelina Otto. Adeline is a postdoctoral researcher at the KU Leuven, the Center for Sociological Research, and of course, one of the researchers within the Babel project as well. Her main research interests include comparative social policy analysis with a special focus on social inequality, social inclusion, and employment quality. And her current research agenda pays special attention to social inequalities in social benefit receipt and in the transition to carbon neutral societies. She also edited or co-edited 2 books on basic income, which provide a detailed historical overview of the idea, give an overview of specific basic income proposals in Germany and France, and which summarize the discussions on basic income in European left parties and in initiative reports of the European Parliament. So she's perfectly placed to give some comments, to give her reflections on what we've learned thus far from the 2 cases and from basic income experimentation and pilots in general. So Adeline, you have the floor. Thank you. You're still on mute.
I know. I hope you can see the presentation. I'm not really sure. Do you see presenters here?
You need to go to display settings.
Yeah.
It's on the top, yes. And then, yeah, click.
Yeah, my computer is kind of slow. I don't have, I can't change this.
And then swap. Yeah, normally you can swap.
No, it doesn't allow me. So it's kind of a bit silly.
Yeah, but we can see it as such. So you can just...
I'm really sorry. I tried to change this, but since I'm working with 2 screens, this might be the reason. Sorry, I didn't test it. I just start. So since we don't have a lot of time, I would like to come back to the original question of today's webinar or online conference, which now I seem to have even lost my mouse. Ridiculous. Which is about what can be learned from well, the experiments we just heard about, but of course there's also still after the break another presentation about the Canadian negative income tax experiment. So I don't want to anticipate David's presentation, but I hope that he actually corrects me if I'm wrong. This is based on some research also that my colleague Cyril Francisco did together with us about indeed things we can learn and limitations of what we can learn. But let's just first start with what do we know from the literature about the results of mainly negative income tax experiments, basic income experiments, and unconditional cash transfers, like, for instance, the Alaska Permanent Fund. In terms of the labor supply, what we find is that the unconditional cash transfers, the Canadian negative income tax experiments, so the MINCOM experiment, and several BI pilots either have no or slightly negative effects with regard to working hours of an average worker. And that's even if the amounts paid were a bit larger, like for instance, in, in the Cherokee casino dividend that was paid. With regard to the US American NIT experiments from the 1960s and 70s, we do not see statistically significant effects. There is also a study of a bit comparable to what we are planning in the Babel project with the lottery money, which is indeed a regular payment of, I think, at least 1,000 euros. So there has also been a study comparable to that with Swedish lottery data. And here we see a small decrease in the probability to work. And on average, that meant 1 hour less per week with a linear effect of the winning prize on the working hours. There was no difference between men and women in the labor supply. But comparable to that is a study on a Massachusetts lottery payment. It has also recorded a small negative effect on the labor supply with a larger effect for people aged 55 plus. You could say this is somehow kind of an early retirement effect. But again, no difference between men and women in the labor supply. I also would like to include here the social assistance reform pilots, because they're not NIT experiments, they're not basic income experiments really, and they're not unconditional cash transfers as they have been conducted in Finland and in the Netherlands recently. Here again, we see small or no effects with regard to the labor supply. With regard to consumption, there's not so much data, so I was really happy to see that Jürgen and his team will take this on board as one of the outcomes to study. We saw that in the USA, in the US American and the Canadian experiments on the negative income tax, there was a slight increase in spending on food, but that might be because the sample which was receiving the benefit were people on very low income. And that might, these people might initially spend the money on more food. And there's also in literature, there's also a report on the Alaska the Permanent Fund, which is an unconditional cash transfer, on the timing of the consumption. So this is not a regular payment per month. It comes in tranches, and people seem to, the moment the money comes in, they seem to spend it rather than dividing it up over a monthly payment or so. With regard to education, we can see that in the US American and negative income tax experiment and in the Canadian one, school attendance, grades, and test scores. Dividend, we see an increased educational attainment of benefit recipients by 1 year. With regard to health, as another important outcome that will also be studied in the German experiment, but was also done in the Korean experiment and the youth basic income, is health. Here we find that the MINCOM experiment showed that participants experienced a decrease in hospitalization compared to the control group, especially for mental health, accidents, and injuries. The Gary experiment, which was a US American negative income tax experiment, also noted some fertility rate decreases, an increase in birth weights. The Cherokee casino dividend, comparable to the first example, has shows improved mental health among the recipients of the Native American recipients relative to non-native participants in the longitudinal study. No impact in the Swedish lottery and in the in the pilots with the social assistance benefits in the Netherlands and in Finland, we saw some improvement of mental health. And because it is reported in the same line, kind of self-reported economic well-being as being related to mental health. There are many other outcomes you can study, and I just have to refer to the long list we just saw in the slides for the German experiment. But one I wanted to still report here is that there was also some self-reported criminalized activity decreasement among the recipients of the Cherokee Casino dividend. So you can see this has, of course, you can study wider effects. Now, all of that being said, there are, of course, complications and constraints, especially with regard to experiments, which make it very hard to come back to my original question, what can be learned, because we have to see these things in their context. And namely, one of the constraints is the time frame. It is hard to draw wider conclusions if these experiments are indeed not long-term, because as we saw from the study on the Swedish lottery data, for instance, people only changed their working time, their working behavior, their worked hours behavior after 2 years. So it might really need some time before people start adapting their behavior. And we see that the time frame ranges from very short-term benefit payments, as in the Ontario BI pilot, until 5 years in the Seattle-Denver experiment. That's the US-American NIT experiment, which was even foreseen to last 20 years, but for political decisions and reasons, they stopped it after 5 years. Another constraint to the generalizability of the findings is that the experiments usually are very context specific. So either they have been taken place in only rural areas, only in urban areas, and then for different subgroups. So it is really hard to draw wider conclusions. We see that in the German BI pilot, from what I understood, it is a much more diverse sample. So you're having people from smaller towns as well as from people living in bigger cities. Another constraint and complication when looking at the results that we have so far is the sampling and the sample size. And this is something that has to some extent been mentioned by Carl Weiderquist in his research, but not actually to the bottom of it. So one of the huge limitations is in many of these experiments, only low-income households are sampled, which creates a very particular group to study. And we see that there is a somewhat more diverse sample with regard to income in the baseline wave. That's actually my question I still had to Jurgen Schub about the German experiment, because I wasn't sure what is the baseline 1, what is the baseline 2, but I understood that at least the baseline 1 receives it for 3 years. But indeed, we have again a very particular sample, namely a particular age group and one-person household, single-person households, which ignores a lot of dynamics also going on at the household level. The sampling method is a problem because in the NIT experiments, for instance, you use randomized controlled trials, but there's a pre-sampling basically. You limit it to particular ethnic groups, they limit it to low-income households. They even did, in some of the cases, an oversampling of higher income households among the low-income households, anticipating that these people would produce less costs and that they might drop out, that their dropout rate might be much higher because they might be able to be attached to the labor market, have higher incomes, and so on and so forth. So this again biases the results the conclusions we can draw. And then the sample design in some of these experiments was also very poor because you had already a very small amount of participants, which was then divided up into sometimes up to 13 different treatment groups, which makes that in some of the cases you had only 20 or 15 people being studied. Another fact that was already mentioned by Jurgen Schub was that with these experiments, you cannot measure community effects. We cannot draw wider conclusions on labor market changes or macro level changes in the production and consumption, in prices and wages, in changes of values and culture, migration flows, just to mention a few of them. And what we saw, but maybe David can correct that, at least for the MINCOM experiment, from what we saw from the NIT, from the negative income tax experiments, And most BI pilots, they do not analyze actually the tax effect. And the tax effect is particularly relevant for NIT experiments. So even if they had different treatments with withdrawal rates, they were not analyzed. They rather reported the average outcome for the whole group, ignoring differences in the treatment, in the design of the benefit. What was also ignored is if the type of funding via an income tax, carbon tax, capital tax, if that changes some of the behavior. And we also see as another really big constraint to even further understand the implications and effects is that in many of these cases, at least in the past, there was not a proper scientific monitoring or analysis of the data. So that would be one of the big problems here. More specifically, with regard to the NIT experiments in the 1960s and 70s, we also see a lack of treatment variation. I mentioned that already. They had very different groups and just didn't look into that. They just reported overall employment effects, but then you don't know what type of benefit amount, and so on and so forth actually has what kind of effect. And when they constructed the samples in some of these experiments, there was an underreporting of income and employment status so that people would be sampled in to receive the benefit by just underreporting their income and employment situation. To continue, not too long, and for the UCT, coming back to the unemployment cash transfers, like the Alaska Permanent Fund, or the Cherokee Casino dividend, or the Korean Youth Basic Income Program, they have the advantage of long-term community effects they can see because they're given for longer, but usually there are conditions linked to that. So it's not a proper BI. Either they're linked to a specific age or to a specific ethnic background, or there is some means testing. And so you can draw some conclusions, but again, it is limited given these particularities of the benefit. And the funding source can be very specific, context specific, like in the Alaska Permanent Fund. So what can be learned? That experiments can be meaningful and provide valuable insights on some potential basic income effects. I'm actually referring here back to Jurgen Schub, who said the same. But that is only the case if you take into account time frame, context specificity, sampling and sampling sizes, who need to be carefully considered. And so I can also just conclude with Carl Weideck saying, well, the best is that the experiments are being conducted, but then you also probably have to look into them and make the best out of that. We also recommend that we clearly see that proper scientific monitoring and analysis is needed and proper public data archiving. I think that's something that we will also hear from David about the really interesting disappearance of the data of the Mincom experiment, but we see the same for the NIT experiments in the US. It is actually not possible to get grip of the original data to overcome some of the flaws in the analysis that has been done. And if possible, that's also something we clearly see in the past. It is best if the pilots are independent and the research around it from political decisions and bargaining, because indeed these programs can be stopped earlier or they're influenced in some way, like in the Finnish experiment, in the design. So these are the things we would say are important messages to take away. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much for these reflections and comments, Adeline. There were already quite some questions in the chat. I noticed that our presenters have been very active in replying already to these questions. But I would prefer to ask them in public again, and you can briefly answer them, because I'm not sure that everyone will have access to the Q&A or will read the Q&A. So it might be good that we in public sort of respond to these questions as well, as that's okay for you. So some questions for Jürgen. One of the questions was about the sampling, right, and the selection with the potential selection bias in the number of people who self-admitted, right, to receiving such a basic income. So what would be the impact of that is basically a more general question. What would be the impact in your estimation of self-selection into the group of people, you know, who want to receive a basic income? And then there was an additional question related to that. How did you find these participants for the experiments within the group of people who are actually opposed to a basic income? A second question was about the individualization. So you, in the German experiment, you really focus on individuals. And one of the questions, and I think this is a really particular issue, a really important issue, what about households? Because in many of the experiments that have been conducted, for instance, the one in the US in the 70s, we really observe, you know, that there are household level effects in the sense that working hours are reduced usually for partners, right? So would there be a way to sort of include this in your experiment or in the evaluation of the experiment? And then also a question about the generalizability of the results. In how far can the results that you are going to have be generalized to a very specific but also very important group for universal basic income, namely social assistance recipients. And the person is asking this because the selection criteria, as you mentioned this in your presentation as well, seem to target people who are in the range of a median household income. So maybe Jürgen, you can first try to answer these questions.
Yeah, thanks for wrapping the questions up. And yeah, on the selection of our study. When we were thinking about doing this kind of research, we also had some calculations of using a randomized sample. Yeah, and we had calculations from survey institutes who are recruiting online surveys. That was more or less set at the beginning, that we want to have an online survey as a research method and not with interviewers because of limited budget, yeah, and therefore online surveys. So a randomized online survey with a specialized target group where we have already selections, and I will talk on the rationale later on. But finding such a group, we had calculations of you have a maximum chance with a high budget of having about 10% response rate, and 90% no information or hard to add weighting factors and so on. So a lot of people will be lost on the way to the final recruitment of those 1,500. Yeah, we wanted to start with. And therefore, it was a question also of money and of doing the best if we don't go the way of a randomized sample technique to find alternatives. And our alternative was a press conference, a joint press conference, and all the newspapers, if you can make the test and make a Google trend search on that day of 20 August. And the weeks after that, nearly each newspaper was writing about that event and the possibility that you enroll in this experiment in Germany on a new UBI. And that is also the reason that not only those who are in favor and the fans of a UBI enrolled, but also who are very skeptical about it. But they heard, well, they will get 1,200 euros just for answering I think 6 or 7 questions, and they already made calculations how economic rational it is to invest that time to get for 3 years that money. And therefore we had, of course, the majority of supporters of the UBI idea, but from a number of 2 million, and that's a lot if you have a data set on that. We also had many or still enough of those who were against it. Of course, we did not talk about that we will have a split in the afterwards, but because then they would also answer that just side question on whether they are in favor or not at the recruitment minute. But that was our idea, that we cope more or less the average support side and not supporter side of the UBI, and also we had, of course, calculations from the statistical office for that specific group. Yeah, 1-person household in that age restrictions and income distribution. So we had additional information on education, on German, non-German, regional aspects. So we did not want to have a cluster just of Berlin hypers of UBI. That is a risk that can happen, but we had a really big recruiting sample where, of course, the majority we were writing, well, we are really sorry, but we will drop your name and also your information at the end of the year, because you are not selected for the next stage. In terms of efficiency, this was a waste, but I think for making the best and using the words of Karl Weiderquist, well, they are, and make the best of what is makeable. We tried hard to go that way of a so-called river sampling, but to at least for the group we selected at the end, the one-person household in this age group and the income distribution, we really can generate our results of our sample and what happens to that group. Not for the rest of the population living in Germany. And that also answers the question of Mr. Wolf, that for the group of the long-term unemployed means tested, they are out of scope. They had no chance for being included because they live with a maximum. If you also add their income, this will not be higher than 1,200 euros, even in Munich. And therefore, this group is out of the process of generalization. And why? Well, we cannot set out our existing system of social security with our randomized control experiment. We would be happy if this could work, but no, it will not work. So the consequence would be if we pay them 1,200 euros and they are on long-term unemployment, means tested, they would not have more money. They would have different money. We would just save taxpayers' money and substitute it with money paid by a crowd community. And we could not detect causal effects of an unconditional income. And that is the scientific purpose of all our experiment. So this was the design. If we really want to make a scientific contribution to this debate, people really have to have that money. And also it will not, and the good thing would already is, usually for this amount, that is about more than 40,000 at the end for the period of 3 years, you would have to pay taxes of a gift tax. Yeah, because the amount is above the threshold that is tax-free if you get just gifts and benefits. But the crowd idea that was approved by the financial office, that by this crowd idea, there will be no gift. No gift that is above the threshold of 20,000 euros. That is the threshold. That is where you don't have to pay taxes from or deduct taxes from your gift. So this is from those both sides. We were happy that there will be no deduction, and they really get it on top. And that therefore we also concentrated on individual households because of that threshold. But there is a second thing. If we would add families, of course this would be interesting. But then you would need a household design to follow the stream of money. Or you would have to give it to everybody in the household, and that would also be a problem of the design. Therefore, this was the scientific rationale, and you can be sure those who the social entrepreneurs they were not happy with our scientific decisions to restrict it on a core element of our population. And a potential answer could be to increase it if you really would be able to replicate our or to put another UBI experiment at that site. And well, there is some movement that also or at least the Green political party is now in favor not to implement the UBI, but they are open to do research and also field experiments on this issue. And this would be a chance that if we talk on a sample of 2,000 individuals, then you could differentiate, and then you could also address that neighborhood effect. Yeah, that you take a big city like Berlin and different areas, low income, high income area to detect. I think that would be the answer, but. Yeah, yes. we have limitations and strong restrictions.
Absolutely, it again depends, of course, and indeed on the interactions with the existing welfare state system, and that is a constraint on any experiment that we conduct. Okay, thank you so much for your answer. I also have some questions for Dr. Yu at the Gyeonggi Research Institute. There was one question in the chat, but I think that was already answered on the age limit of 24, right? So why exactly the 24 and not 23, for instance? Because we can imagine that not everyone is studying until 23, and then is between studying and working in the middle at 24. So there might be other cases or other contexts in which a lower age limit would be helpful, I guess. So maybe it would be good to respond whether you have considered these lower age limits. I also had a question on the public support for the youth basic income, because you mentioned that those recipients, so the 24-year-olds who actually received the basic income, that they thought, well, this goes a bit against my social norms, so I see this as an investment which needs to be paid back in one way or the other later on in life, so it's an investment. But how did the general public think about this? Was there strong support by taxpayers, for instance, for this youth basic income, or was there strong opposition? Or, you know, so I would be very interested to hear your experience with, you know, the popular support for the youth basic income.
So at the beginning of the program, Youth Basic Income, there was over 50% of negative opinions on this program. But as time goes, it changed. So majority of people is positive on this program, Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income.
Okay, thank you. And so, do you want to say something about the age limit, or?
Oh, you mean why 24-year-olds?
Yeah, why 24 and, for instance, not, I mean, 23 or 22, in the sense that there might be a lot of 22-year-olds who are not necessarily studying. So they might, you know, actually need this kind of youth basic income as well.
I think I already answered the question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So in Korea, if you are 24 years old, men and women, you are in the middle of nowhere, meaning that you are neither a student nor a worker. And that means you don't have any income. So it makes sense to give youth basic income to 24-year-olds. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, in the sense, but, or, I mean, so, are all 22-year-olds then in higher education, or do they work, or so?
As already mentioned, the youth basic income is an expanded version of Seongnam youth dividend.
Mm-hmm.
So firstly, Jae Myung-lee, then the mayor of Seongnam City, he decided to give youth dividend to 24-year-olds. And also there is a budget limit. So we had to choose the specific age group. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so, and then, given the scarcity of the budget, it makes sense to focus on that particular age groups who is, you know, in between study and work. Okay, thank you so much. So there was another question on the Mincom experiment, but my guess is that our next presenter will be happy to answer that on the neighborhood effects. That might be perhaps better measured in the Mincom experiment. But my suggestion is that we have a short break for now, because we already had a very long session, and that we come back here at 3 o'clock European time, of course, to start with the next session, in which we will delve in which we go into detail to the Mincom experiment, and also we'll get some reflections and comments by Sarah Marchal of the University of Antwerp. So see you all in a few minutes. Thank you. So shall we start?
We can start? Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. So as you can see, we have a lot of participants here in the room. They're all very motivated. They like basic income. They really like this idea. And I'm extremely glad to introduce David Calnitsky, who is currently assistant professor in sociology at Western University in Canada. David holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Let me just say briefly that I first met David at the European University Institute that was in June 2015, I think. At the time, Philippe Van Parijs and myself, who were completing the draft of a book on basic income. And we had a workshop on the book. And David was among the most stimulating, and I must say also the most critical discussants of our draft. And I'm extremely grateful for that. So thank you very, very much. Thank you once again. So David's research interests include work, poverty, social policy, and social theory, but he's well known among social scientists for his careful empirical work on the MINCOM experiment, the Manitoba Basic Annual Income Experiment that took place in Canada at the end of the 1970s. Through this work, he has studied the impact of basic income on a range of outcomes from wages and labor market participation to social stigma and gender dynamics. His articles have been published in some of the best journals in the field. So thank you very much, David, for being with us today. And the floor is yours.
Let me just first share my screen. Is that working? Can people see my screen?
Yes, we can see it perfectly. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, great. So thanks so much for inviting me to speak to you. It's really nice. It's really exciting to speak about my work, and thanks to Yannick for inviting me and for that really nice introduction. The Babel project, if that's how it's correctly pronounced, is really interesting and exciting. So I'm glad to be a part of it. And it's also nice to have Sarah providing some comments. I've been looking at some of her papers, which look really cool. Okay, so I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to talk about basic income in the labor market, and I'm going to go over some of my findings from a basic income experiment, which I've done research on. The study was this 3-year guaranteed annual income, GAI, experiment that took place in the 70s in Manitoba. It's called MINCOM. And I guess I want to start this talk with my own sort of normative perspective about basic income, and then I'll present some research and focus on a particular paper that I wrote about the impact of basic income on wages, on employer-employee relations, and on the labor market dynamics more broadly. Okay, so at the top, I should say that the core normative motivation for my interest in basic income, why I like the idea, is connected to the greater social and economic bargaining power it affords, or is hypothesized to afford, to poor and working people in labor markets, but also domestically. That is, women in bad marriages, typically, or often marriages of economic convenience. In terms of social policies, I like to distinguish between, on the one hand, policies that benefit people, and on the other, ones that benefit and empower or strengthen them. We can distinguish, in other words, between ameliorative reforms and emancipatory reforms. That's a distinction that's sometimes used. So traditional welfare policies, these are ameliorative, they provide benefits, and I support them, but they probably don't really, as programs, expand people's power. In my view, basic income, or the guaranteed income, is significant because it provides exit options. So now there are some objections to this view, which I will mention later in the talk, but I think Carl Widerquist and others are right to say it gives people, basic income gives people the power to say no. And so from a socialist perspective, which is more or less the milieu I'm coming from, these points can be described in terms of a critique of capitalism. So I think one of the foundational objections to the structure of capitalist labor markets is that they are superficially free, but substantively unfree. Non-owners of the means of production, workers, can choose between capitalists, but they're ultimately forced to choose one, right? Marx calls this sarcastically a double freedom. Our freedom to be exploited by the employer of our choosing is coupled with the freedom to remain hungry should we choose none, right? So, you know, for people who object to that kind of de facto compulsory nature, the de facto compulsory nature of the capitalist labor market, basic income is appealing because it ensures that people have, you know, not just the abstract liberal right to freedom, but the material resources to make that freedom a reality. You know, or if you prefer to talk about freedom as a continuous rather than a dichotomous variable, then it improves people's freedom, we hope. And just so back to Widerquist's power to say no idea, the power to say no is, I think, the power to say no to bad employers, to unpleasant work, but also to patriarchal domination in the home. The idea is, in providing alternatives, you are affecting underlying power relations. You're changing the background conditions in which negotiation takes place, right? Both at work and at home. To add a little bit of emphasis, the guaranteed income or basic income, it provides exit options from some of the key sites of domination in people's lives. So what are two of the most important sites of domination in many people's lives? Well, it's the workplace and the family. Okay, so this talk is going to focus mostly on work, on the labor market, but from my perspective, basic income is appealing because it promises to weaken relations of domination in both of these arenas of life. And I have a couple papers with Pilar Gonalons Pons on the sort of impact on gender, on domestic violence, and on the family. So nonetheless, it's still the case that it's really not clear, it's not obvious, I think, what the actual direct or indirect ramifications of an implemented basic income might be. There has been a lot of academic and even more popular discussion around basic income. And I think that, you know, despite the enthusiasm, we still probably have to admit that we have a limited understanding of these policies. Most of the discussion of basic income is speculative, and much of the empirical work comes out of randomized control trials, which I think are great, but also have flaws, at least with respect to asking certain important questions, right? Where, in particular, where social interaction is relevant. So nonetheless, I think, you know, empirical work is immensely valuable. It's the best way to understand what might happen when you change a key aspect of a system that's as complex as, you know, the work-income relationship. Well, it's to observe it. So I'm going to try to present some of that evidence. Okay. So the evidence I'll present is from the Mincome experiment, as I've said, and I think it helps to build the case for basic income's normative desirability. But first, some background. So a few details on Mincome. It was funded by the Canadian and Manitoba governments. Everyone in a small town of about 10,000 people, it's called Dauphin, Manitoba, had the option to access about $20,000 for 3 years. That's Canadian dollars, and that's 2014 dollars for what it's worth. Everyone was mailed one of these. Can you see my cursor? Yeah. Yeah, so everyone was mailed one of those in the town at the outset. There's also, Mincome also has a randomized control trial portion that takes place elsewhere in Manitoba and in Winnipeg. In Dauphin, by contrast, anyone can potentially join, right? In the Winnipeg setup, they use this. They use randomized and dispersed sort of individual treatment and control subjects. So the big question is what happens, right? What happens when you eliminate poverty as the ever-present background condition of life? What happens when you weaken people's dependence on the labor market for basic survival? So I'm going to tell a bit of Mincome's history and then provide some evidence on work. Do people actually work less? Typically, this is the first issue that comes up whenever basic income is discussed. After all, dramatically weakening economic activity could undermine the tax base for a basic income. So, to spoil the punchline is basically that at least my evidence suggests that they do work less somewhat. And here I use qualitative and quantitative evidence to get at some of the reasoning behind the drops in waged work. For example, care work and education, they're cited in the qualitative evidence. And then I'm going to look at labor markets from employers' perspectives. How does reducing people's market dependence affect business? How does it affect the wages that they offer? And at the end, I'm going to respond to a paper, a really interesting paper by Jurgen Schub and Simon Birnbaum that provides a little bit of a critique of some of the arguments I've made. And finally, and I'll give some theoretical normative conclusions. Okay, so just one final issue of clarification to state up front. There were similar experiments in the US at the time of Mincome, but they were all randomized control trials examining isolated individual and treatment and control subjects that are kind of scattered across various locales, towns, and states. Many other recent research experiments are set up in a somewhat similar way. I think Mincome, so Mincome also includes an RCT in Manitoba, which I'll talk about a bit, but the Dauphin portion is unusual in that it takes place within the setting of a community where everyone can join, and it has that kind of realism in terms of how it might ultimately be implemented in such a setting. I could be wrong because I'm very easily out of date, but I don't think we have other cases where a rich country has tested a guaranteed income at the level of an entire town. Someone should correct me if I'm woefully out of date there. But so this is important, I think, in my research, because it means we can start to observe macro effects. We can start to observe social interaction effects that are ignored when a small group of subjects are treated amidst a sea of non-subjects, right? So it's important insofar as I think you think that people are impacted by other people. Okay, so very briefly, a potted history of Mincome. In the late 1960s, Canadian poverty activists, academics, policymakers were affected by a number of really frightening reports about the extent of poverty in the country. And at the same time, there was an awareness of the guaranteed income experiments and the broader discussion of the guaranteed income with Nixon's family assistance plan, which nearly passes in Congress. And so the newly elected NDP government, which is Canada's Social Democratic Party, the newly elected NDP government in Manitoba, provincial government, proposes this experiment really with the idea that it would become a nationwide program. This is NDP Premier Ed Schreier, who's kind of an interesting figure. He says that he thinks that, quote, the guaranteed annual income is necessary and inevitable He says the government of Manitoba is explicitly dedicated to try to provide greater equality of in conditions of life to the individual citizens of our province. He's a genuine social democrat, and he framed the guaranteed income in the context of a sort of broader social democratic project, in the context of poverty, but also inequality. At the time, he says in the same interview, he says that he thinks that the pay gap between a captain of industry and a rank and file worker should be no more than 2.5 to 1. And he says, I think that's a realistic goal to strive for. Still, Schreier also worried about some of the questions that I'm trying to ask. So he asks, in a sense, is there a danger we will be just subsidizing local merchants? Would employers hold back on wage increases, which otherwise might have been granted because wages in effect would be supplemented? That such a result would defeat the ends we are trying to achieve, right? So he says this before in one of the early documents connected to the experiment. But the focus of his interest in the guaranteed income was really was linked to sort of the old problem of dividing up the poor into separate social categories. He says that if we can get around the legal barriers which so rigidly separate the employed from those on welfare, well then surely we'll have made a solid step forward, unquote. So that's all to say that this moment signaled, I think, a high watermark in Canadian social policy, the abolition of poverty, the complete overhaul of social policy. All of this really was on the historical agenda at the time. Okay, so income. The project itself lasts 3 years. It's underfunded, and eventually, while payments to families are not cut, basically the whole research wing is cut. Mincome then comes to this ignominious end. Most of the survey data that was painstakingly collected is dumped into a warehouse. Some of the Winnipeg data does get digitized, but virtually none of the Dauphin, or very little Dauphin data gets digitized. Most of the data just kind of sits. There's a long period where people do not know where the data is, and no final report for Mincome was ever written. Eventually, 1,800 boxes of raw data land in Winnipeg at an Archives Canada warehouse. By 2009, Archives Canada finally made a finding guide, so you could actually sift through the thing. You could try to make sense of it. So I went to Winnipeg after talking with Evelyn Forget, who had worked on Mincome before. So I went to Winnipeg and started to digitize some of these archived surveys. So the data that I'm using in this presentation, some of it was already digitized, and some of it I digitized myself, but very little was ever examined. Okay, and so briefly, maybe people are going to be familiar with this, but this is sort of just how it worked as a negative income tax. So for 3 years of the experiment, if you did not work at all, the guarantee was $19,500. Again, these are Canadian 2014 dollars. For a family of 4, that is, that's the floor. That was about half of median household income in Dauphin at the time. And a negative income tax of 50% means that if you earn, say, $6,000 on the labor market, you keep that, your guaranteed income is reduced by $3,000 to $16,500, and then you end up with $22,500. And eventually the benefits phase out, right? So everyone has a floor, and you're not made worse off by taking on a bit of wage work, as in sort of the traditional means tested welfare programs. Okay. So these are the groups that I'm looking at certainly in the paper on labor force participation. This is a cute graphic to represent that. In the Dauphin group, people receive income. I'm just trying to clarify the idea that people receive income amidst other potential recipients. And that means you are observing individual effects and social or indirect effects together. And you're capturing these, what I would say are real world social interactions that might matter. In the dispersed treatment in other Manitoba towns here, people receive income, but they're living in the context of ordinary labor markets. And finally, the non-recipient control group, they're also in ordinary labor markets in Manitoba. And here I'm just showing the same groups again, but sort of situated roughly geographically. Okay, so starting with work, this is from a paper I wrote with Jonathan Latner in a journal called Social Problems. And this is administrative data that was already digitized, admin data from the experiment. There are different ways to think about the effect on work, on labor force participation, which is what I'm looking at, labor market participation rather than labor hours. So it's somewhat of a coarse-grained measure. So there are different ways to think about this. For example, people might reduce work, but in the real world, there could be a back and forth with firms, right? Firms might pull wages up that would bring people back in potentially, or people might work less at higher wages. But you're incorporating these dynamics in a community level experiment, I think, but not really in the randomized control trials, which are sort of, you're a drop in the bucket of a large labor market that employers might not notice. There might not be that kind of interaction. And in the Dauphin community experiment, where people see others adjusting to the program, they might adjust too. You can incorporate that kind of feedback, and social norms might shift around when you suddenly face this kind of radically altered social assistance regime. Joining might come to take on less social stigma. Still, I think in both kinds of experiments, RCTs and in this sort of community experiment, the simplest individual level mechanism, your ability to pick up and exit the labor force, is crucial, and we do see it. So here in this figure, we're comparing Dauphin incomers before and during to Manitoba controls before and during. This is also a kind of difference in difference model. That's how we're setting it up in the paper. And you calculate the total effects by getting sort of the difference but in the changes internal to the control to changes internal to Dauphin, right? And so you get in a kind of an experimental, a total kind of effect, a labor force decline of about 11 points, participation points. Now here I'm adding in the households who got the treatment but were sort of dispersed across Manitoba towns. And there, that Manitoba effect, comparing these two Manitoba treatment control groups, there you have about 8 percentage point experimental effect. So I find that in the community context, you see greater declines. You see, in both cases, people do work less, but perhaps in the Dauphin case, there are social interactions, maybe there's copycatting, et cetera, and that could explain why they're greater in Dauphin. Okay, so what were people up to if they dropped out of the labor market? There has been, I think, probably not enough work on this kind of question, on questions related to people's non-employment activities under a basic income. There has been a lot of speculation, though. One theory about the impact of basic income posits that our deepest desire in life is to relax at home, right? An alternate hypothesis predicts that, a host of valuable activities, care work, art, education, artistic endeavors, right? All of these are going to be unleashed when people's basic needs are secured outside of the market. Now, many of these questions aren't entirely askable given my data, but I think it's worth considering the possibilities nonetheless. So in some of the qualitative commentary in the Minkum-Dauphin group, there are some hints about what people were up to, why they participated in particular, and about 11% of the group, unprompted really, indicate that they withdrew from the labor market, and they emphasize a few different things. They will sometimes emphasize using Minkum as help to go to school. We have the chance to improve our educational level in order to improve our income, or to help care for family. I wanted to spend a year at home with my children. They also will emphasize just not finding work. This person says, from this stage on, I believe I can't work much longer, if any. And you have some people stating that they were not able to work. John, his name has changed, had broken his leg and we needed help. So that's some sort of qualitative, that's a bit of a qualitative take on this question. I also have a paper, there's quantitative data on this question. I have a paper with Jonathan Latner and Evelyn Forget about what non-employed people were up to, why they weren't working, right? And this is not entirely comparable, because this is from a separate paper, and it only covers the Winnipeg group, the Winnipeg randomized controlled trial group. But still, I think there's information here. There were only so many options that you could choose from for this survey question. But the largest reason why people were not working, and again, we're comparing changes internal to the treatment and changes internal to the control group, right? This is, again, a sort of difference in different setup. But yeah, the largest reason is work or job conditions, which moves about 6 percentage points. And, which means that people were more likely to be, to not be working because of a labor dispute, or because they said available wages were too low. So perhaps that is a exit strategy. Just to be clear, what I'm combining those two answers into job work conditions. Available wages were too low, or labor dispute. Likewise, just looking at this figure, a negative number of 3.8% under the subcategory ill or disabled, for example, that indicates that the intervention led to a decline in health-related non-employment reasons, right? So fewer people were out of the labor market for reasons of illness and disability. Other positive effects are found in family, and also one option was did not want to work. There's a 4 percentage point change, did not want to work. Given the availability of other answer categories, you could interpret did not want to work as somewhat close to leisure, maybe. It's also worth pointing to some positive effects in self-employment and education. So the data doesn't let us ask all kinds of questions that might be interesting here, but some positive effects in not working for family, leisure reasons, job or work conditions, and education reasons are interesting, I think. Okay, now, some of these questions lead naturally into further questions. The not working due to job/work conditions doesn't exactly get at what people will do with their time, but it does get at the dynamics between employers and employees, which we might want to know about. So what happens there? Okay, so I'm going to move to the reaction from business, from firms. This paper is published at the Socio-Economic Review, and we're talking about reducing workers' labor market dependence, but from the perspective of employers. So here we want to know, how did employers respond to a scenario where the whole labor force has potential access to a basic income, and to forefront the findings, the conclusion I draw, I think, is captured by this Ben Franklin quote that I have at the top. Necessity never made a good bargain, right? Having better alternatives as workers escape the circumstances of pure necessity, they're potentially better able to bargain with bosses. Okay. So one of the surveys Mincome conducted and then archived was a business survey, a survey of employers pictured here, which I digitized. It was a kind of census of business. It was sent to every business in Dauphin and in 7 control towns at a baseline, and then during the study period. And it's worth noting again that these kinds of questions are really only askable in community experiments rather than RCTs, right? When you give a guaranteed income to a scattered handful of people in a city, it's just going to be imperceptible to employers. So here, employers are very likely going to notice when all workers can potentially avoid work. So the main question here is, did workers exit power? Did it force wages up? Did labor markets tighten, right? Or, as some people argued, did government supplements allow firms to lower wages? Was it just an employer subsidy? Perhaps like the earned income tax credit, the EITC in the US, at least as some people argue. Some people want to say, aha, that's an employer subsidy. Okay, so just to explain a little bit the different views here as I understand them. The first argument says, the first view says that labor markets will tighten, either because workers exit, and that might be an explicit bargaining strategy, or they might just exit. They might exit to do something else, school, take care of family, and so on, or because fewer workers end up applying or accepting jobs in the first place with terms that they don't like. The labor market will tighten, and all of this happens because the sort of background conditions for workers are just more favorable. That's kind of the first view. The second argument says that income maintenance policies, they are employer subsidies. So how exactly does that work? I think in the literature, I've sort of seen different kinds of views for explaining what people mean when they say employer subsidy. I think that there are maybe 3 views. One that I want to call the functionalist view, one maybe you could call the unintended consequence view, and finally there's the strategic view, or you could call it the conspiratorial view. And I'll just sort of say a little bit about them and maybe give my take on them. So the functionalist view says that there is a subsistence wage out there in the world, right? And any government supplement that makes workers better able to survive, it allows employers to reduce their contribution to that subsistence, right? only the subsistence wage has the effect of producing an equilibrium in capitalism. That's why I'm calling it functionalist, right? The subsistence wage can be explained by its effects in stabilizing capitalism. And if wages get too high, then perhaps the argument goes, then high population growth and more competition kicks in to bring the wages into line, right? And the opposite is true if wages get too low. This is an old political economy view. I think the very idea of subsistence turns out to be pretty thorny and hard to define. And I think it's also hard to, it's hard to make consistent with the idea of changing wages over time. But in any case, if it is true, I think then it should literally apply to any welfare state policy. Not just a basic income. Okay, that's the functionalist view. The second view says that income subsidies might increase the labor supply, and competition would, as a byproduct, lower wages. And this, so this could potentially be true for work conditional policies like the EITC, but an income subsidy that is not conditional on work, I think we should not expect it to grow the labor supply, right? So this view requires that basic income would increase the labor supply. I've shown that I think that it does not do that. Okay, and the last view says that, the strategic view says that firms are aware of social policies and specifically plan to lower wages that they know workers would likely accept. I think this could be true. Although it would also allow firms that could afford ordinary wages to poach the best workers. And second, I think it would require some knowledge of social policy on the part of firms in the first place. That might be true for very, very large firms, but it might not be true of most firms. And finally, the last sort of like my last comment on this idea is that I think, again, it could be true for literally any welfare policy. Okay, so those are the two views as I see them. First, I'm going to mention some employer comments. In the survey, there's a little bit of room for qualitative commentary. It's mostly empty. The survey is mostly empty in terms of qualitative comments. But from what you do see, they don't seem to really like the program. They're not that into it. So this employer says, quote, "If the government wants to do something about the basic annual income in Manitoba, the best thing they can do is get out of the picture and let supply and demand rule and govern what the wages and hours should be. At this rate, if one wanted to eat, they'd have to work. The program is just spoiling people rotten and upsetting the workforce something unreal. The hours people have to work, the wages they get, and the output they give, which isn't much, just make it impossible for the average employer to even stand a chance at hiring help." Okay, so he's not thrilled. There's another, this other person says job applicants were unacceptable because they were not willing to train at a reduced salary. Okay. So those are a couple qualitative comments. People not so warm on the program, but really the survey is meant to collect quantitative data. It asks about the wages that firms offered before and during, and in control towns before and during the experiment. So these are descriptive statistics, and what I find is a big increase in the sort of median wage offers on job vacancies. So these are specifically on job vacancies on the part of Dauphin firms. I see an increase and no change in the control, right? They're asked, what's the starting wage on this job vacancy? This was a slightly different question. It's median wages on new hires, people they actually did hire. what was the wage rate on this job? And that's of persons that were hired in the past 4 months. And again, wages on new hires grow faster in Dauphin. In the control, they sort of keep pace with inflation. I don't show in the paper, I'm not showing graphs because oh no. Okay, that's interesting. Sorry for that. Yeah, I guess I was just saying that I don't show graphs in the paper because reviewers thought that it would be better to present all this information in a table. I think it's obviously clearer as figures, so that's why I'm presenting it this way. And one part of the explanation might be a tightening of the labor market and a decline in firms receiving applications, right? So here the question is, did you have any applications to your place of work? And the portion of people saying yes in Dauphin kind of declines. The portion of people saying yes in the control towns doesn't really change. And finally, fewer applications might have meant fewer new hires. So here they're asking how many new people were hired in the last 4 months. The portion of people saying none stays pretty much the same in the control towns. The portion of people saying none increases. So in particular, because of the wage effects, I think it's reasonable to conclude that having an exit option from the labor market improved worker power. And I think that of the competing perspectives I mentioned above, if I didn't caricature them, I think the first is more likely to be true, or perhaps there's some truth to both, but on net, the first is more powerful. So here's the paper that I wanted to mention. This is a really interesting paper from a couple scholars who write a lot about basic income, Simon Bierbaum and Jurgen de Wispeler, who I'm sure some people know. So this is an interesting paper, and it takes a different view from my paper, and they are arguing that their sort of argument is that the exit strategy that is proposed frequently by basic income advocates is in fact a hollow threat, right? So they want to say the exit strategy that's proposed by a lot of basic income people, i.e. the ability of workers to leave their job or really to threaten to leave their job. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about the ability of workers to threaten to leave their job by virtue of having a basic income option, and thereby improving their bargaining power on the labor market. They think that that's actually a hollow threat, that it's likely to be a hollow threat. The authors argue that for basic income to actually work as an exit strategy, workers, vulnerable workers that they want to talk about, workers must be able to credibly signal, right, an intention to leave their job unless conditions improve, right? They have to be able to threaten in a credible way. They must have a credible threat, and if employers are not persuaded that that threat is realistic, then those employers will not give an inch, the authors argue. They go on to argue that most workers, especially vulnerable workers, face important constraints in the labor market, and then part of what they're doing in this paper is they're just listing those constraints. So workers face these important constraints when they're considering, were they to consider an exit option as this tool for obtaining concessions. And the authors want to argue that these constraints, they're going to remain in place, even with a modest but non-trivial basic income, right? So they want to say that in the end, the exit strategy might actually be an exit trap, right? It's if people end up exiting, then they might end up jobless. So my view on this, I was a referee on the paper, actually. Yeah, so my view is, I really like the paper. I think it's super interesting, and I think it raises the level of debate. It's a really sophisticated set of arguments, but I do think that it's not persuasive ultimately in the end. If you want a general, if you're interested in a general take on the net impact of basic income on the labor market bargaining, right? They pitch this paper as if it is about the impact of basic income on bargaining power in general, right? On net. But in the end, they end up saying that that question, the impact of basic income on bargaining on net in general, is actually outside of the scope of their paper, because what they want to focus on is this one mechanism, this exit strategy mechanism. So I think that their view is, or their conclusion is, they take an overly narrow focus, right? They are focused on just one mechanism that could be in play in the labor market, right? Threatening to leave your job, threatening your boss, right? Or signaling that you're going to be leaving your job, not actually leaving, but threatening to leave in order to extract concessions. That's what they're talking about specifically. It's that mechanism that they're talking about. Meanwhile, other mechanisms, all kinds of other mechanisms that bear on bargaining power, I think in the labor market are likely to be more important. And that would include a general reduction in willingness to accept or apply to bad jobs in the first place, right? They're not really referring to some of those points. That can tighten the labor market. It can pull wages up. It can improve bargaining power potentially. An unintentionally tighter labor market due to those labor supply declines. It's not strategic in the way that they're using the term. No one's signaling to a boss necessarily that they might leave if you don't behave better, but that stuff is happening in the background, and I think it's likely to be more relevant to the overall bargaining context than these specific games of chicken that they're talking about and criticizing and saying are less likely to expect. And I think the authors don't really disagree on this point. So it also might be the case that labor markets labor markets tighten as people exit the labor market, right? They might not be using exit in this strategic way, right? They might not be using an exit strategy. They're just exiting. They're just exiting for whatever reason, and that might affect the labor market as a whole. So, the objection is that an exit strategy per se, which involves threatening to exit, not actually exiting, requires having this credible threat. And they think that the constraints are going to remain. Even with a modest, non-trivial basic income, those constraints are going to remain, and all that makes the threat hollow. So on balance, I just think that this is the point that they're making, I think, is narrow. On balance, I think it's just not likely to be the most important labor market mechanism that's going to be impacted. The range of unintended consequences, I think, are going to be a lot more important, and it's wrong to then draw general conclusions, which they do. It's wrong, I think, to draw general conclusions on the basis of just this one mechanism. The second point I would make is that the authors might be right that constraints remain, but I think the question that you have to ask is, are they going to be tighter or looser with a basic income, right? It's not a binary. The authors give reasons, good reasons, why it's hard to leave a job, full stop, not reasons why it's harder with a basic income. And I don't see any good reason to think of that this kind of strategic exit, however relevant you do think it is, I don't see a good reason to think that kind of strategic exit wouldn't be easier, a little bit easier. So ultimately, I think that what we should care about here is the net effect of basic income on bargaining power, on wages. The authors point to this one mechanism, and they implicitly draw this broad conclusion, rather than, I think, admitting that perhaps the net effect, the taken together effect, might be that bargaining power and wages could grow. Last, I also think that in general, that the exit trap argument might be overdone. They say the availability of a meager basic income could lead some precarious workers who strongly dislike their jobs to exit when it's likely to, in fact, make them worse off in the medium to long run by underestimating the difficulties in securing an alternative occupation. That's what they say. So first, I'd say that since in their argument, since you don't actually exit with the exit strategy, right? It's about a threat, not leaving, then I think you can't really fall into a trap of non-employment, right? If you've never left. The whole thing is about a game of chicken. It's about threatening. But that's maybe pedantic. But second, perhaps more importantly, the argument that they're making here, I think, is a little bit like saying we should not make divorce feasible for people, more feasible for people, because they might underestimate how hard it is to be single, right? Or how hard it is to remarry. It seems to me like, in both cases, it's better to have the option rather than not. Having more options on a dating market might, lead you to pass over a decent catch, but, I think that's not a good argument against having options in general. So ultimately, I'm not persuaded by their approach to basic income and the labor market in this paper. Okay, so here, this is my last slide. To sum up the business response paper, it's possible, I think, to imagine an income maintenance system serving business. Perhaps if the level was sufficiently low, or really if it failed to facilitate labor market non-participation in whatever way, exits, whether they're strategic or not, or hesitation in taking jobs, or potentially if it's conditional on work, like the American Earned Income Tax Credit, perhaps. But I think that a sort of a MINCOM-like, a generous, comprehensive, guaranteed income policy, something that is unconditional on work and reduces workers' market dependence, I think they are likely to improve worker power and wages. And I think they're unlikely to garner support from business organizations. The hope is that if such a policy were instituted, even in a partial way, its popularity would swamp business opposition. Just as an aside, that's a point that I think is relevant. I'm often a little bit skeptical of surveys about the popularity of basic income under this or that set of circumstances, or when you write the question in one way or another. I think the sort of interpretation of it when you actually have it becomes meaningful in a completely different way. And people tend to not want to lose gains that they've made. Okay, just a final couple brief points on work and labor markets. I think that a basic income that genuinely makes work optional, or one that raises the reservation wage, it might mean that some people would work less in formal labor markets. I think work reduction in general is this point that basic income advocates sometimes equivocate on. On the one hand, people talk about how they favor liberation from the employment relation. Freedom from waged work is sometimes regarded as this great unrealized historical opportunity, and it's always just on the horizon. It's often argued that basic income, is desirable because it provides people freedom to do what they want with their time, freedom to spend their days as they choose, right? And that includes leisure or other things, that might not be that politically vendable. But then on the other hand, we often prefer results from guaranteed income studies that seem to show little or no work reduction. I think that the labor market findings here are roughly what you want. No work reduction would mean no expansion of freedom, no lessening of toil, but extreme work reduction could potentially unravel the program. Moreover, work reduction can mean increases in other socially valuable activities, perhaps, care work, school, artistic endeavors, community engagement, activism, etc. But I think it can also have an impact on bargaining between employers and employees. And here again, I think that there's some equivocation from basic income advocates. You see some people who want to say that, yes, it might improve worker power, but others who want to say that, no, employers are going to be fine with it. They're not going to present a barrier. Business is going to be on board with a basic income that's actually desirable. That's actually something that we also want. I think you probably can't have it both ways. And I think it's reasonable to expect some employer opposition to a desirable basic income. That doesn't mean it's unattainable, but it means it won't be easy. So some conclusions about basic income in the labor market from my own normative perspective. I think that, so long as the growth in persons doing no valuable labor is not explosive, so as to undermine the program's viability, and so long as the growth in wages and worker power is not so explosive as to spark some mass employer exit from the economy, then I think the sort of underlying moral arguments, that workers ought not be forced into the labor market on pain of starvation, that leisure ought not be the sole province of the rich, as long as those fatal outcomes don't come to pass, then I think that the moral arguments can hold their own. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much for this really inspiring talk. It was exciting to see all of these slides and results, and particularly your normative interpretation of this, right? I think this is very insightful also for the work that we do in the Babel project. So thank you so much for that. And good thing is actually that one of the authors of the paper you critique is in the audience. So Jurgen Wispelare is participating to this conference. So Jurgen, if you want, you can seize the opportunity to sort of ask your questions or object to what David has told us. So and this also holds, of course, for the other attendees. So if you have a question or if you want to say something, please add it to the chat. We can also give you the opportunity to ask your question in person. And I see that some people are already asking questions in the chat, which is good. I also want to mention to Yannick, if one of your students want to intervene or have a question, so you can, for instance, convey that message to David if you want. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Sarah Marchal to give some comments and reflections on David's talk, and afterwards we open the floor, of course, for questions. Sarah is a postdoctoral fellow and very, very soon to be assistant professor at the Center for Social Policy at the University of Antwerp. In her research, she looks for ways to measure welfare state institutions and indicators to assess whether and how these institutions help combat poverty, how effective certain benefit designs are, and how benefit take-up develops in Belgium and Europe. Her main focus is on minimum income provisions in Belgium and Europe, in particular on social assistance benefits for able-bodied people of active age. So Sarah, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Thank you, David, for the very interesting presentation. It's really captivating to see how you use these data to add insights to often a more philosophical or hot debate. So I really like your research. Also, what I really appreciate about the paper is that you make this distinction between that we that there are important normative grounds to support a basic income, instead that it gives exit options and choices back to people, and that is in fact what we should, what would be the added value and what we should be looking for. And I think your research really illustrates that that is the case, that in the Canadian experiment, that these options became available to people. In that regard, I also find very interesting your results on what people did with their time, or where the graph where you showed that, well, people reported less often illness or disability for not being in work, as there was another exit option. You no longer probably had to work until you were too sick or too ill, and also you did not have to think of yourself as being not fit for your job if your job became too hard for you. Something that's caught my eye when I was reading your slides this morning, because this is actually a proposition that has now been made by a political party to actually allow people to receive unemployment insurance benefits also when they quit themselves, rather than when they are being fired. So also in these broader debates, I think your research really gives some added insights, or at least some new ways of considering what is happening here. This is also the case in your paper that you presented, or at least at the results you presented on that the employers actually were not able to claw back the basic income, or at least the basic income that was awarded in the Dauphin experiment. I always say Dauphin for some reason. In this Dauphin experiment, because of the tightening of the labor markets. And this was something that was really interesting to me, because of course it is the idea that labor shortages will ultimately lead to better work conditions. And of course we should expect a basic income in such a regard to actually lead perhaps to a tightened labor market. But when we here in Belgium have certain occupations, certain jobs that remain vacant, where we really see that there is a labor shortage, for some way or another, that does not really translate in better work conditions for these types of jobs. Often these are jobs that are highly flexible. Also, they require some specific education. But what we do see is that it's not really the people in unemployment insurance or in minimum income protection that are pushed towards these jobs, which might explain why work conditions might not improve. But what we do see is that migrants, that are often migrants that take up these jobs and well, make sure that for now there are no severe labor shortages. What I was wondering was whether also in your experiments, you see these kind of dynamics that, at least in your experiment, in your analysis, whether you see that these kind of dynamics exists, where this tightened labor market is to some way mitigated by migration into this Dauphin region at the times that wages were increasing. To what extent they actually mitigated this broader, well, bargaining power that might be underway there. And also, if that's not the case, what would it learn us for our current situation if we would really think through introducing a basic income in our current setup, where there is migration, where it is very clear that there are wage differentials between countries, how that would pan out. These were my two main reflections or questions that popped up when I was listening to your presentation, but I was also asked not only to directly answer to your presentation, I was also asked to reflect a bit on what a basic income might mean in terms of our current EU member states, and this from my own background as a researcher into minimum income protection. And often when I tell people that I do research into minimum income protection, then the reaction is always, oh, great, you're looking into a basic income. Of course, you cannot really fault people that, because minimum income protection or social assistance schemes in Europe often have misleading names like a basic allowance or a citizenship income. So really policymakers try to get this idea across. I think that really it should be accessible to all, and that it's a very nice idea or a very good policy. But it does confound the issue on what actually minimum income protection is here in Europe. Basically, what I would like to highlight are three characteristics of minimum income protection. Minimum income protection in the sense of social assistance, of the means tested benefit of last resort, that has, to use your words, an ameliorative aim in order to prevent severe poverty, to protect people from severe poverty. But that's the main goal, to really make sure that this very severe deprivation is mitigated. And to do that in the sense that people, but only on the condition that they have no own income, no own means of existence, that they will then have access to a low benefit, the floor of the welfare state. This minimum income protection was actually a quite late addition to European welfare states. It's only around after the social insurance schemes generally became fully mature and covered most of the target groups that they are still covering today, that European welfare states started to introduce means-tested general social assistance, and especially they were relatively late by covering the working age of the able-bodied of working age. So before that, it were generally the elderly or the disabled that were covered, but really the active age population that is able to work, these were only from the 60s included. And only very recently, really just a few years ago, also in Italy, Greece, and Spain. Now, since then, all EU member states do have means-tested minimum income protection. And this graph shows the benefit level for a lone parent with 2 children, expressed as a percentage of the median equivalized household income. So basically, the benefits are quite low. They can be combined with housing allowances, heating allowances in a number of countries, with child benefits in others. But still, net disposable income in most cases remains below this at risk of poverty threshold. And an additional issue with all these different types of benefits is that sometimes application moves through different channels, that you really have to apply for each of these different benefits at a separate agency. On top of that, and this is also very interesting in relation to the basic income, is the accessibility of minimum income protection, where usually citizenship and residence requirements apply. So citizenship, you should be a member you should be a citizen of an EU member state, and you should currently live in that particular member state in order to get minimum income benefits. And we see now that more and more member states are actually making these residence requirements more harsher, that you need to have lived in the member state already for a couple of years, that there's really a connection. It is no longer everywhere enough to just reside there at the moment of application. Your means need to be insufficient. This means that in some countries, this can be really Kafkaesque, that they look at your current incomes, not use the incomes that you have, that the government knows. No, they really need to know everything. You have to get there with your papers. Sometimes they take alimony into account, gifts from parents that are made on a regular basis. So this really intrudes into the private sphere of benefits applicants. And on top of that, it's also from this idea of severe poverty and not being able to take care of your own, they usually also look at assets. So asset tests are included in these means tests in all minimum income protection schemes. But here, and I think this is interesting, there are very huge differences between the EU member states. With some where the family home is included, others where it's only other real estate that are included. Savings, you also have exempted goods, usually a car if you're not mobile anymore. And other countries have disqualifying goods and really state that boats or yachts or computers or helicopters are excluded. So there's really this huge variation in wanting to pinpoint, into wanting to micromanage what people should do with their money, how intrusive it is. There's also discretionary assessments in these asset tests, in these means tests, which basically means that a social worker is allowed to make his or her own assessments. I think this is important also in terms of a basic income, because it allows for smoothing the rules somewhat. For instance, this family home that is in a couple of Protestant countries, the idea is that you should sell it before you have access to minimum income protection benefits. There, this is according to the law, but the social worker can override this if they say, well, in this situation, this is not applicable, so that there really can be a more longer term plan where the social worker actually can help or support the claimant. This is a graph of a paper I wrote together with Sarah Kuiper, Schirlin Verbis, and Yves Merks on asset testing. Basically, what we did was looking how important these asset tests are in terms of eligibility. I just show this to illustrate that these asset tests really have an impact in that they exclude a large number of people, but also this is just eligibility based on the rules and based on EU silk. There are a lot of shortcomings, but still these data with 7% of the Belgian population that would be eligible for social assistance, whereas in reality it's more around 1 or 2% that actually takes up social assistance. This illustrates that there are some difficulties in really accessing this benefit. And I think that these accessibility requirements that maybe quite harshly, a bit Kafkaesque, that they certainly won't help. Also, conditionality of minimum income protection will presumably have an impact in the sense that people might be scared when they find out what all that they might be a bit apprehensive of the conditions that are required when applying for minimum income protection, which again may feel too intrusive into a personal private sphere. This conditionality is there because we believe as a society that it's needed to guide people to work, because otherwise, as you say yourself, they might not want to go to work, and it could be a very large problem. So usually what we do is really pay attention to the fact that there should be a gap, that there should be financial incentives for those on benefits, and that when they make the transition to work, that they should be financially rewarded. But that opens up a lot of problems in the sense that we really have very inadequate benefits, precisely because wages and wage incomes are already quite low. However, and I think this is interesting, is that over the EU member states, we see very large differences between this gap between net social assistance and net minimum wages. Really here, I've ordered the countries based on the gap between net social assistance and net minimum wage, and really see that this gap can be very large in, for instance, the UK, but on the other hand, is also very small in Austria, Denmark, Estonia. And it is possible that countries have adequate benefits and at the same time also very low incentives. So that these financial incentives are not everything, but it also likely has to do not only with this conditionality, but also with the scope, with the labor market, whether there are actually jobs for people and whether it is possible to smoothly make this transition. So to sum up, if we look at minimum income protection in Europe, we are of course a long way from a real basic income. On the other hand, there are huge differences in conditionality, accessibility, and also adequacy, with a number of countries being far more lenient in terms of asset testing, in terms of conditionality, and in terms of these financial incentives. What I think what this illustrates is that in a number of countries, there really are perhaps some more easy way forwards in order to make it more accessible. This would require a bit of mistargeting or accepting that you cannot really pinpoint who you should target, but you could ease access and make sure that this discretionary assessment of the social worker is only used in favor and not used to really nitty-gritty try to single out the most needy. Of course, still nowhere near a real basic income, but might perhaps mean a very have a very positive influence on the number of those who would be eligible and the lives of those who could be eligible. I think that's what I wanted to add to the discussion, Wim.
Yes, Sarah, thank you so much for these interesting reflections and comments. Maybe two housekeeping messages. So I asked Yannick to ask his students whether they had questions, and he mentioned that they already left at the end of your talk, David, but that they are going to ask their questions next week in next week's class, and that Yannick will send them to you by email, right? And I also got a message from Jürgen that he very much appreciates your plug to his work, and that he looks forward to continuing the debate, but that for now he's interested in listening to other people's comments and reflections. But I'm sure that the debate will continue on this. So there are, I think, 3 questions that I would like to read out for you. Maybe you can then tackle them all at once, and also, if you want, reflect a bit on Sarah's intervention as well. Is that okay? If that's okay for you, David? Okay, so a question actually from Yannick. So if you want, Yannick, you can intervene then in person as well. He asks that many UBI advocates defend the exit option argument by referring to the idea that workers will exit abusive work relationships in order to train, study, or find another and more promising job. But there's this assumption there that training opportunities are available, that education is widely available, or that better jobs can be found. But is that really the case? Doesn't it show that you need a strategy that couples UBI with other investments, in particular in training infrastructure and job search coaching, to make that an actual valuable option, right? That's the first question. The second question from Thijs asks how you would convince employers that basic income is a good idea also for them, or isn't that possible? It seems difficult to implement the basic income without their support, or at least a silent approval. So what kind of strategies would you suggest to actually, get employers on board with the idea of a basic income? You have a question from Louise asking, and I think that's a good question. So why the Mincome project, or why in the context of the Mincome project, the people then responsible bothered to running such a careful experiment, only then to abandon and shelve all the data. So what actually happened then? And then I see that there's a final question from Ijin Yu, that Dr. Yu and himself conducted a survey in Korea in July 2021 on the willingness to work with a basic income with a sample of 10,000 people of the general public. And that they found that the willingness to work increased with increases of the payment until the amount of 500,000 Korean won, which is roughly $500 per month. And after that threshold, the willingness to work started decreasing. So is that something that you can relate to, or do you know, or anyone has any studies or evidence on this non-linear effect actually of the generosity of the amount and its relationship with the willingness to work? So that's already quite a lot. So I will give you the opportunity to respond to that. And if there's time left, we can continue, of course, the conversation. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks so much. Yeah, there's a bunch of questions there, which I'm gonna and I'm gonna respond to all of them poorly. But yeah, so I maybe I'm not getting the entirely the gist of Yannick's question, but the sort of exit idea, you know, whether or not it kind of depends on or a strategic exit, perhaps, whether or not it depends on investments in infrastructure and so on. Yeah, I mean, it could be that could be what some people have in mind, and it would potentially make the sort of retraining, education, and return to the labor market process smoother. But I just think that people might exit for a range of reasons. People might be exiting in non-strategic ways too, right? Without this sort of like this plan to then return. They might be exiting just because they want to take care of their kids or their parents or whatever it is. I don't know if I totally responded to the kind of key point in your question, but I guess
I'm sorry, just to perhaps be a bit more precise, it's because I see that many basic income advocates try to convince the skeptics by saying, well, you know, you will see people will train, will invest in themselves, and then they will find jobs that better match their aspirations. But this is really dependent on assumptions about the availability of these services. That was the point. If we really want the exit option to function like that, it costs more than the basic income, because you also need to invest in new services.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and that's going to lead some basic income advocates to say, no, what we really want is a basic income public services combined strategy, insofar as that is the mechanism that you really care about. On the point about how do you convince employers, I think if we're talking about proposing some Mincome style basic income, I don't think you are going to convince employers really. If it's going to look like Mincome really, I think for the most part they are not going to be on board. I have a separate paper about the history of opposition to basic income proposals in different business groups in the US and Canada, and they're just really consistently opposed to any kind of income maintenance policies that look like Mincome. When they are highly conditional and small, that's when you'll start to see some support from some of the more enlightened business groups, Chamber of Commerce type groups. They're not going to support under any circumstances. So how do you do it? I think the only, I don't know the answer to this question. One idea is that you get some kind of basic income by stealth. You try to offer some kind of unconditional basic income, something that's got a lot of the policy features that we like, but is very low. And then insofar as you buy into the ratchet effect theory of social policy, which I kind of do, then it might be the case that, you know, the way you think about it over the long term is that occasionally there will be opportunities to expand it, right? But it's not really going to be likely that it will be reduced insofar as you buy that argument. I kind of buy that argument in general in terms of social policy. I do think it is really, really hard. Certainly in America, there was just a book that came out on this topic. I think it's really hard to reverse social policy laws in particular. So, you know, one way to do it is the frog in the saucepan kind of way. You start small, and then occasionally there will be opportunities to try to grow it. Mostly they'll fail, but maybe sometimes they will succeed. And when they do, they stick. I mean, that's at least the way I try to think about it. But, you know, it's a hard question. Don't have the answer. There was a question about why did they bother running the thing in the first place if they were only going to abandon it? Well, it was different people who abandoned it. It was different people who were in power federally, and it was different people who were in power provincially. So in the province, the NDP, the Social Democratic Party, they lost an election to the Tories, to the Conservatives, who had no interest in it at all. And they expected initially, Minkum people expected to be able to apply for new funding. They expected, oh, it's going to be really popular. We'll just be able to apply for the research budget later. The Conservatives had no interest in expanding the research budget, and they also didn't have support federally. The thing was a joint federal provincial project, and the Trudeau Liberals, the sort of centrist party, they also lost an election, and they were out briefly. They also lost to the Conservatives, so they were gone for almost a year, and it was that kind of context in which they sort of abandoned the thing, and all of the researchers went on to different projects. Yeah, so the tide turned. I think this kind of thing happens with experiments. It happened a little bit again with the Ontario experiment. Just recently, it was proposed under a Liberal government, and then the Tories came into power, and they were no longer interested. So I think that's just like, that's potentially a lesson about experiments. If the kind of story about implementation and lock-in, well, that's something that can happen if you actually institute the thing, but there's no lock-in effect with an experiment, right? There's no stakeholders, right? People aren't gonna, for the most part, people aren't gonna want to defend the thing. It's just an experiment, and so it's easy to see how I think they get abandoned. I don't think, some people have experiments. Some people like the idea of experiments because they want to understand basic income. Other people like the idea of experiments because they think it's a path to implementation. And I don't think the latter is likely true. It would be great if someone pointed me to a paper about the relationship between social experiments and outcomes, and those policy outcomes. But I would venture a guess that there isn't a strong link, that social policy experiments do not lead to to that policy passing. Why? Probably because people are not academics for the most part. People aren't sort of, the way policy passes isn't really, aha, this is a social policy that like has all the has all of the results that we like, that we said were desirable, and therefore it passes. I just don't think that's the mechanism for social policy passing, although I think some people that like the idea of basic income experiments sort of have that in mind, that the world operates in the way that they think about experiments. Aha, this is a rational thing to do, now let's implement it. Okay, a couple points that Sarah made that I also don't have good answers for, but there's a point that she made about migration. In the case of the Minkum experiment and Dauphin, I think there's not going to be a lot of insight that you can gain from the Minkum experiment on those questions related to migration, because it was not allowed. It was disallowed. If you were not a if you were not a resident of the town at a certain date, whatever it was, you couldn't participate, right? So there's no inflow of people. The only maybe general thing I would say about migration and basic income is that people will sometimes raise this point as a kind of critique of basic income. Well, what if people flood in and they get to participate in the social policy that they like, that we all like? I think that just could be true. But I don't think it's in general, I don't think there's a good argument that we shouldn't improve conditions of life, in the country that we live in, just because it might be the case that that people might want to be here, right? What's the alternative? And you pointed to some studies that suggested that tight labor markets didn't change work conditions. If I heard you correctly, maybe I didn't hear you say that, Sarah.
No, I didn't point to these studies. No, it's just that the impression here is that these labor shortages do not lead to better working conditions in specific jobs. I'm not aware of any studies that specifically look at that. So
right. Okay. And I'm not either. Yeah, and in the Minkum case, I don't have evidence about work conditions at all. I only have evidence about wages. And I think it's reasonable to make inferences about work conditions and the conditions in the labor market more broadly. But and my intuition is that tight labor markets will lead to sort of better work conditions. But I don't have evidence on it. Yeah, I think that was most of the comments, unless I missed something.
Yes, so thank you so much for all of your insights and comments, and I mean, and all of your work basically in relation to basic income, and helping understand these effects and what this might mean, for workers' powers and empowerment of individuals. Maybe I have to, with an eye on time, I have one final question, and I'm not sure whether it makes sense. So if it doesn't make sense, you can say so. But one thing that I was thinking of is, you mentioned that benefit systems or social protection systems in general should strive more for empowerment, right? So that they really should be designed in such a way as to empower people, as to increase their autonomy, right? But how does that relate to social work? In the sense, social workers are actually trained to empower people, right? They are trained to support people who are actually drawing these means-tested benefits, right? So one of the upsides of having a means-tested benefit systems is that once you apply for it, once you're eligible for it, usually a social worker or a social work in general comes into play as well and starts supporting you in all sorts of different ways, which is actually meant to be supportive, right? It's meant to actually empower people to increase their autonomy and to actually help them reintegrate in society. Wouldn't it be a danger of a basic income that actually that empowering role of social work, would be less effective, would be less necessary perhaps, or would come less into play with potentially detrimental effects for actually the recipients of a basic income? What are your reflections on that?
Yeah, I think that's a that's a really great point. There's lots of ways in which social workers can have empowering effects. I guess the main way that I would respond to that point is just to say that when I use that term, empowering social policy, and when we compare the guaranteed income to traditional means-tested welfare, something like Ontario Works in Canada, in Ontario, I think I'm thinking of different people, different individuals in play, right? So I think it's probably true that for the very poor people who are on social assistance, it's completely possible that social work and social workers are going to be empowering. The empowerment effect that I have in mind is something that might hold, I think, for a different group of people, of not necessarily the very poor, but perhaps workers more broadly, people above the poverty line. Yeah. Okay,
thank you. So yes, I think then it's time to close this event. I think we've had some fantastic presentations and gained a lot of insights also, and I mentioned this before, but also in terms of the Babel project, right? So this is just the first year that we are conducting the research, and this kind of input is really fantastic for us as well. So thank you all. I would like to thank all speakers for their contributions, all people who have reflected on the speakers, all people who have asked questions, for being here, for participating. And I hope, of course, to see you all back again at our next event. We will try to organize a yearly public event. And so hopefully we'll have some results of our own next year. And, you know, I hope to see you all again then, or hopefully at the time sometime sooner. So thank you so much to everyone, and enjoy your evenings or your day or your night, depending, of course, on your geographical location. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.